Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is David Leese, and I work as a vice president at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. And isn't this great? Would you believe that we are sold out, and we are so proud that each of you could join us today to both network with each other. If you only knew who's all in this room, probably Ken Muse almost knows 90% of you. But it's a fantastic group, and we're delighted that each and every one of you are here today. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to set the stage really quickly. I've been asked by some people, believe it or not, what is the Frontier Center for Public Policy? And if I had to answer that question concisely, it would be about better ideas to serve you. To serve who? Canadians. Why not? So the Frontier Center for Public Policy has had quite a story through its research and analysis and its orientation towards open markets and respect for the individual rights and freedoms of the individual, to be able to promote public policy that serves Canada. We draw on an incredible network of fellows, senior fellows from across Canada and around the world who have been on the forefront of so many positive changes. We believe that discussion is more important than ever. I think of a quote, because when all think alike and no one thinks very much, by Walter Lippmann. Well said, Walter. So Frontier is about thinking and action. We have a display there. A number of people have already picked up many items. We encourage you to look at that book, as Peter Hawley said. But we welcome your ideas and feedback, and we encourage you. If you remember one thing out of today, other than the key points from the Honorable Preston Manning, is to please sign up for our newsletter. You can find that on our website at www.fcpp.org. Please sign up for the newsletter, and I think you'd be pleasantly surprised what you see. We are very delighted that each of you are here today. We want to thank our lead sponsor, Parrish and Heimbecker, and for sponsoring this event. So let's give them a round of applause. We're also delighted that so many of you have purchased tables, and we really appreciate that level of support. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. The Honorable Preston Manning served as a member of the Canadian Parliament from 1993 to 2001, and as leader of the Loyal Opposition from 1997 to 2000. He founded two political parties, the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance. Both of these became the official opposition in Parliament and led to the creation of the Conservative Party of Canada, which formed the federal government from 2004 to 2015. Indeed. So to put it into context, Preston Manning has seen it a lot. He has seen the freedom movement and the conservative movement across our country, our great country, change and morph into its different forms. He is a dear friend of Frontier. We were honored that, as Peter mentioned, we could publish the document about COVID-19 and looking to key strategic questions that we as a country more than ever need to reflect on as we come out of this period. So be sure to look at that. Be sure also to listen to his interview on Leaders on the Frontier. And in that discussion, I think you'll be quite inspired by his insights, as you will today. In many respects, the Honorable Preston Manning can be described as Peter Hawley has said. Preston Manning is in many ways the best Prime Minister Canada never had. Because it is in this context, in this state of our nation, that we know that we are all vitally concerned about the future of Canada, our beloved country. A country that has so much assets and so much opportunity is floundering. It's in this context that the Honorable Preston Manning comes to us on the theme, Rebuilding Our Country. So without further ado, please join with me in welcoming the Honorable Preston Manning.
Well, I'd like to say thank you, first of all, to David, to you, and to the Frontier Center for the enormously important work that you do, and especially for putting on this event. Henry Kissinger once observed that if you get up to high political office, you use up your intellectual capital. There's no time to generate it or produce it, so you're dependent on others for the generation of your intellectual capital. And in Canada, we have these think tanks that generate a lot of intellectual capital, particularly for those of us that are participating in the arena. And for its size, which is quite modest, I think Frontier generates more research and ideas per dollar invested than virtually any other think tank in the country. And that's a real accomplishment for which you are to be complimented. Now, the subject that I was given is really the future of Canada, which is a rather broad subject that would take a lot of time and greater wisdom than I have to deal with properly. In fact, I'm reminded of a story of a Canadian lawyer who spent his entire life studying the Canadian Constitution, Canada's constitutional problems, another huge subject. And he died and went to heaven. Some lawyers do get there. And he was told that all the new arrivals here get to ask God one question. So his question was, will Canada's constitutional problems ever be resolved? And so St. Peter took this question, he came back, he said, the boss has two things to say to you. He says, yes, Canada's constitutional problems will be resolved, but not in his lifetime. And so when I'm faced with this question of the future of Canada, it would take a lifetime to really address this. But what I want to do is touch on a few encouraging thoughts about what can be done to make that future as positive and bright as possible. There's a lot of pessimism in the country today about the future of the country, about the present state of the country. But I want to deal with it. I think there's some positive things that can be done, and those are things I want to share with you if I can. With respect to our economic future, if you ask yourself the question, what are Canada's strengths? We don't have the largest population in the world. We don't have the largest stock of financial resources. We don't have a salubrious climate. We don't have the best government, but don't let me get on to that. But what do we have? As the second largest country by area in the world, we have the second largest, perhaps the largest stock of natural resources on the planet. That's a huge strength, something no other country in the world hardly can come close to or say. And if that's the case, then I believe we need our natural resource sectors, agriculture, energy, forestry, mining, and the fishery, to be recognized and treated not as relics from the past, not as sunset sectors, not as environmental liabilities, but as fundamental building blocks of the Canadian economy. And this is particularly true of Western Canada, that natural resources is our strength, and their recognition and their development is one of the keys to a prosperous future. Now, one of the challenges today is that with 80% or more than 80% of our population in the cities, in the urban centers, while our natural resources, the soil, the water, the mineral deposits, the forests, are in the rural areas, there's not much, there's less and less understanding in the urban areas of the importance and the nature and the scope and the breadth of those sectors. I asked some of my university-aged grandkids, what do you think of when I say the agricultural sector? And they say, well, you think of grain in the fields and maybe cattle in the pastures. Of course, that's just the producing subsector of the agricultural sector. What about the agricultural processing sectors, the seed plants, the packing plants and so forth. What about the agricultural manufacturing sector that turns a lot of those goods into food that's on the shelf? The agricultural manufacturing sector that produces tons and tons of equipment and tools that are used by that sector. What about the agricultural service sector, the veterinarian and the inspectors, the consulting firms and so forth? What about the agricultural knowledge and the technology sector, the ag faculties at the universities and so forth? If you ought to add all that up, yes, there's this producing subsector at the bottom, but you add that manufacturing, processing, servicing, knowledge, technology sector, the contributions to GDP, the contributions to employment and the contributions to income are a lot bigger than what people think when they just think of agriculture's grain and the cattle. And that's true. You can build that pyramid for the energy sector, you can build it for the forestry sector, you can build it for the mining sector, you can build it for the maritime resources or the fishing sector. So I guess one of the things I'm saying is one of the changes I think that's required in public policy to build a positive future for the country is to stop penalizing and harassing these sectors and recognize them and treat them for the importance that they have. To stop stop penalizing and harassing the agriculture sector with respect to fertilizer reduction mandates. Stop harassing and penalizing the energy sector for anti-pipeline legislation and so forth. So this is one positive thing that if we can build on those natural resource sectors and get their recognition and development, I think that opens up an enormously positive future, particularly for Western Canada. Now, with respect to Canada's political future, let me just suggest three things which could be done to make that future brighter. One is to understand and harness bottom-up political energy, so-called populism. Populism's got a lot of negative today. There's ways of harnessing bottom-up political energy, and I know something about that, to national objectives. Secondly, I think we got to regain public and political control over the huge public bureaucracies, which now occupy the commanding heights of government, both in the provincial capitals and in Ottawa. And thirdly, there's a need to recruit and train more people of competence, commitment, and character to participate in public life in elected office. I mean, we've just participated, of course, many of us in celebrating the life of Queen Elizabeth, and talk about a person of competence, commitment, and character. We need more people with characteristics like that in the elected arena. So let me get into each of these just a little bit. On populism, so it refers to these bottom-up political movements. Then they can have their wild and woolly side that often is used to discredit them. And that wild and woolly side needs to be avoided, recognized and avoided. But although few commentators recognize this, in the 20th century, the portion of North America that has had more experience with populist movements, populist parties, and populist governments is where? Western Canada. Populism is to our political culture. It's our political culture what soft nationalism into Quebec. You cannot understand Quebec politics without understanding nationalism, soft nationalism. Well, I argue you can't understand the politics of Western Canada if you don't understand something about populism. And let me give you some examples of the positive side that populism can be harnessed to. With respect to providing women with a greater opportunity to participate fully in Canada's political affairs, Louise McKinney was the first woman elected to a legislature in the British Empire, not just in Canada, in the entire British Empire. Where was she elected? She was elected in Alberta in 1917, and she was elected by running for an outfit, a populist outfit called the Non-Partisan League. A populist movement put the first woman in an elected legislature in the British Empire. Agnes Campbell Macphail, the first elected woman in the federal parliament. How did she get there? She did not get there through the traditional political establishments. In fact, they fought her tooth and nail. Eventually, the Liberals knocked her out of the parliament. But she got there as a member of the old Progressive Party, which was linked to the farmers' parties, the United Farmers of Manitoba, United Farmers of Saskatchewan, United Farmers of Alberta, all of which were populist movements, many of which got into politics. The so-called famous five who got women recognized as persons in Canadian law. Some of you remember this case. It was a famous case, 1929. There was talk about women being appointed to the Senate, but the law said you could only appoint persons to the Senate, and it was argued that women were not persons. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that no, they were not persons. Incidentally, 4 of those 5 judges were Liberal appointees, 1 by Laurier and 3 by Mackenzie King. But they said women weren't persons. Then it was appealed to the Privy Council in Ottawa, in London. They reversed it, and women became recognized as persons in Canadian law. But those 5 women that pushed that case, they were all members of populist movements, populist parties, mainly the farmers' parties of the 1920s. On the constitutional and resource front, what's the most important constitutional amendment from the standpoint of Western Canada that was ever achieved? It was the 1930 constitutional amendment. Remember when Manitoba was expanded to be the bigger, not the postage stamp province, but the bigger province. When Alberta and Saskatchewan were made provinces in 1905, the federal government retained control of the natural resources, unlike what it had done with Ontario or Maritimes or Quebec. And it was a long fight to try to get a constitutional amendment to return the ownership of natural resources and to the provinces. And it was led by who? It was led by a populist party, the United Farmers of Alberta, who formed the government at that time. And they got it through the federal parliament because there was still a few old progressive and Farmers Party guys in the parliament that were propping up Mackenzie King's government, and they said the price of you staying in power is you giving us this constitutional amendment. This is a major constitutional amendment. It's the reason, of course, Albertans celebrated because it's the reason oil royalties flow to Edmonton instead of to Ottawa. It was an enormous accomplishment, and it was accomplished by a populist party in alliance with populist members of the federal parliament. And then one other example that is particularly relevant today, the original version of Medicare 1.0, whether you agree with it entirely, because it's 60 years old now and there's some need for reform there. But the original Medicare concept with universal coverage was pioneered by who? By the CCF in Saskatchewan, a populist party, one of the 2 populist parties created in the Great Depression. So these are examples of positive, that bottom-up political energy being harnessed to political objectives. Part of our culture. And I think one of the challenges for ensuring a solid and good future for Canada and for Western Canada is learning how to harness the next waves of those populist energies to some positive objective. How do you harness that to budget balancing? Can you harness that to tax reduction? Can you harness that to rethinking how this whole COVID business was managed? Can you harness that to the demand for Medicare 2.0, which is obviously made necessary by the COVID crisis? Populism, it's properly harnessed and managed, can be a positive force to advance some of the interests, particularly of Western Canada. I'm reminded of Thomas Jefferson, of course, one of the founders of the American Republic and the American Constitution. And towards the end of his life, this would have been the 1820s, he was asked, if you were rewriting the American Constitution, would you still vest as much power in the hands of the ordinary people? And he was being asked this at a time when Andrew Jackson was coming on the political scene. Jackson was the Trump of that day. He was not from Virginia, and he was a wild son of a gun. And you can imagine the elites of Virginia, including Jefferson, having their reservations about it. But when they asked Jefferson that, he wrote to a friend saying, I can think of no safer depository for the ultimate powers of society than in the people themselves. And anticipating the objection, but the people themselves, they're not educated, they'll go off on wild things, they'll chase some wild guy like Andrew Jackson. He said, and if you think them not fit to exercise self-government with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. That's a pretty good statement about the possible power of the ordinary people if their discretion is properly informed. Let me turn on to the bureaucracy. I mentioned one of the other things to guarantee a positive future is to regain public and political control over the public bureaucracies, which now occupy the standing heights in of government. I'd ask you, what is the largest and most powerful political party in Canada today? It's not the Liberal Party of Canada. It's not the NDP. It's not the Conservative Party of Canada, despite the huge surge in its membership in this last leadership thing. The biggest and most powerful party in Ottawa today, and each provincial capital, is now the Bureaucratic Party, a heavily unionized organization that is increasingly political in its own ideology and policy positions, and frequently at odds with the democratically elected parliament and legislatures to which it is theoretically accountable. Today, if a party or a leader wins an election, what have they really won? They've won the right to ride and direct huge public bureaucracy. It's like winning the right to ride the bull in the Calgary Stampede. And consider the significant advantages that the bureaucratic bull has over the elected rider. First, there's its sheer size. At the federal level today, there's 352,000 federal civil servants, supposedly directed by legislation produced by 338 members of the House of Commons, and that directed by 38 to 40 cabinet ministers. 38, 40, 338, 350,000 civil servants. Talk about a size differential. And then there's the permanency of the bureaucracy. The elected politicians come and go, but the civil servants can be there for a lifetime. And if the bureaucratic bull doesn't like the elected rider, no worry, that rider will soon bite the dust or ride off into the sunset and be replaced by someone with even less experience. And of course, there's a difference in the feed rations, the pay differentials. In Alberta, the elected premier is paid $186,000 to serve 4.4 million people, while the unelected head of the Alberta Health Services bureaucracy, which now numbers 100,000 people, this is a provincial health department, is paid $650,000 per compensation. $186,000 for the premier, $650,000, and for about 4 or 5 other bureaucrats at the top of that heap. One of the biggest challenges, therefore, facing any elected government, and particularly a new one with a new leader, is deciding how to manage and direct the bureaucratic party, especially if it's hostile to what you're trying to do. And in theory, there are 3 ways to handle this. One way is the conventional way, which is to try to work with the civil service on the assumption that at least there's a number of civil servants that are professionals and dedicated to genuine public service. This is often the most frequent way. Well, I'll find the people I can work with. The challenge on that is the civil service will always be very cooperative. Yes, Minister. Yes, Minister. We'll do it immediately, Minister. Your will be done, Prime Minister. But often that is just a reason for delaying or actually going in the opposite direction. A second approach, and this is the one that Trump says he'll use if he gets a second term as president, is to treat the takeover of the government by an elected politicians as the equivalent of a hostile takeover in the private sector. When one company takes over another by gaining ownership of a majority of the shares, but the management of the company taken over is opposed to the whole thing, and 40% of the shareholders also are opposed. And it's a draconian approach. It's the hostile takeover model that's used in the private sector. It can lead to a general strike in the public sector, but it can be effective in getting control of a government if it's done immediately. It has to be done immediately, within 6 weeks of the takeover of a government. And then there's the third approach, and that is to do an end run around much of the bureaucracy by creating special agencies that outside the conventional departments that the new government can appoint and control much more readily than it can control the bureaucracy. The federal and provincial emergency measures organizations are an example of this approach. Back a number of years ago, it was determined that the federal Defense Department's bureaucracy could not handle national emergency. Bureaucracies are not, it's an oxymoron to ask a bureaucracy to handle an emergency. They're not set up to, I'm not criticizing even their intent here. They're not set up to do that. They're cumbersome and slow. And so these emergency measures organizations were originally set up as an agency outside the department to handle national emergency, and gradually expanded to include health emergencies, which is how they got into the COVID business. And I don't have time to get into this, but I'll leave you with this question. Why the management of the response to the COVID crisis was not assigned to the EMOs and instead assigned to the federal and provincial bureaucracies is a strategic question that has yet to be answered. And when it is answered, I think one of the lessons we'll learn from this, don't hand emergencies over to bureaucracy. They're not congenitally set up to handle them. So whatever the alternative strategies are for reasserting democratic control over the bureaucracies, they need to be considered and taught to candidates for public office and would-be leaders before they take office, not after. Trying to learn this after, it's too late. And this may be an area where some of you, particularly in the private sector, that have dealt with public and private bureaucracies that suffer from the same problems, may be able to be of help in providing guidance to new leaders, particularly on how to deal with the bureaucracy, if you get the chance to ride that bureaucratic bull. Bull can be used in several different ways. Yes. Well, I shouldn't divert into stories, but you know, in the old days, there used to be official hecklers at political meetings. Some of the older guys will remember say each town sometimes used to have their special heckler. And in one of the last ones in Alberta was in the town of Athabasca, and I think it was the Liberal leader was giving a talk there, and this guy was at the back of the room, and he about 3 minutes into his talk, he yelled out, "The cow is dead." And of course, you're taught as a speaker just to ignore these idiots. But 5 minutes later, the cow is dead. You can tell the audience is starting to snicker because everybody knows what's being set up. So he goes on and on and on for 25 minutes. The cow is dead. So finally, the speaker blows up and says, "What the heck? If the cow is dead, will you please shut up? If the cow is dead, we don't need your bull no more." So, anyway, mentioning the bureaucratic bull brought that to mind. Okay, but the third thing, if we're strengthening us for the future on the political front, I believe there's a need to recruit and train more people of competence, commitment, and character into public life. I've been involved since 1968 in recruiting, trying to persuade people to run for public office, often provincially in Alberta, but then federally and across the country. And it's getting harder and harder to persuade strong people with good qualifications to even consider it, let alone do it. It's just getting impossible. You can go to a community, you can go to a place with 5 names that have been suggested to you by others that know the community. Number 1 won't go, number 2 won't go, number 3 won't go, maybe number 4, maybe number 5. And what are the reasons? There's several reasons. One of them is that they say two things. I will not subject myself or my family to the abuse that you're going to get when you get into public life today. And they're particularly talking about abuse through the social media. And the second one is I can't take the pay cut. And unless you can start to answer those questions in some sort of a way, we're not going to be able to recruit a lot of people into the of caliber into running for elected office. Now, one of the things for the parties, and perhaps this needs some nonpartisan organization dedicated to improving democracy to do, is to develop a recruiting system for identifying these persons of competence, commitment, and character, but identifying them upstream. I don't mean 6 months before an election, which is often what we do. I'm talking about 6 years, 10 years in advance, while those individuals are still moldable and while they can be prepared to handle some of the things that they're going to get, not just to get elected, but what to do after they're elected. And in this regard, I think we can learn something from your Winnipeg Jets and from the Calgary Flames, where the city I come from. I have a number of grandsons who play hockey. And of course, like many of you, my wife and myself have gone to an infinite number of hockey games, starting at the grade 5-year-olds right up to, and by the time you get to Pee-wee, you're there at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning in this empty arena. But if you notice along the back row of the bleachers, there's a couple of people, sometimes old grizzled guys with clipboards. Who are these people? They're scouts. Some of them with connections to NHL teams, scouting 12-year-olds to see if there's somebody here with perhaps the ability and perhaps the will that if they were given the right kind of training and the right kind of encouragement, 10 years from now or 6 years from now, they might be able to sign a contract with an NHL team. And I guess my question is, where's the political equivalent of that? I have a letter here. I won't read it. It's taken out of a book, but it's written in 1960 by a Pee-wee coach with scouting responsibilities sent to punch Imlach when he was general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And this guy says, I've got a 12-year-old kid here with potential. He's playing in such and such a tournament next week. You should send some of your guys to take a look at him before somebody else does. And by the way, his name is Bobby Orr. This is 6-7 years before Orr ever got anywhere close to being able to sign a professional contract, but somebody's scouting him that far up. And I guess my question is, don't we need that kind of a scouting system today? And the kind of a system to encourage those types of people all along the way, to provide them the training, not just to get elected. I've participated in all kinds of seminars. There's all kinds of consulting firms and party mechanism for getting elected, and it's important. And you want to get in the arena, you got to get elected. But the bigger thing these days is what to do after you get elected. How to handle the bureaucracy, how to handle public affairs. I've seen members of parliament when they put a bill on their desk and say, what's this? Nobody told them, like, you make statute law. You're the only guys that can do it. But nobody told them that. Parties never told them that. Parties told them how to get elected, and how high to hang your poster, and how to knock on the door. That's fine, but so there's a great deal of need to recruit people with this kind of caliber, I think, and then encourage and provide them with the tools that they need. So one last thing, and then I'm open to questions or advice on any of the points that I've raised, or anything else you may be thinking about. In this age of social media and expanded communication capacity, I worry about our tendency to discuss, to conference, to blog, to Facebook, to tweet, and substitute discussion and talk for actually doing something about the subject we're talking about. And the important thing is not to discuss the future of Canada ad infinitum, but to decide on one or two things we can personally do to ensure that that future is positive on the economic front, on the political front, or whatever front that you're working on. So for example, is the to-do thing to buttonhole your federal MP or provincial MP, and I appreciate the members of the legislature that are here, but is it to buttonhole your MP or MLA and ask them, and when you do this, you don't do it kind of, in our Canadian way, I hope I'm not bothering you, but no, you look them in the eye and say, I want to know whether you and your party are committed to recognizing and dealing with the natural resource sectors of this country as fundamental building blocks of this economy. I want to know. Tell me. So you're doing something more than just having a friendly discussion on the subject. Is it to join rather than knock these populist movements? There's going to be these populist movements, the West's producing them all the time. The Freedom Convoy was one of them. There's going to be another one demanding that a full-blown inquiry be held into the COVID thing. There's going to be more of these bottom-up things. And you can do one or two things. You can knock them and say, look, there's some pretty scary people connected with them. I don't want to have anything to do. Or you can get with them and try to help them to avoid making the big mistakes that discredit them and channel that positive energy into some constructive objective. Is it to meet with some of your business colleagues? Is another to-do thing to meet with some of your business colleagues and have a discussion on this. What would be some guidelines that we could give some of the newly elected politicians on how to cope with the public bureaucracy? There's people in this room that have dealt with bureaucracies, dealt with the public ones, but there's the big private ones. There's the same problems. But some of that experience, how can you deal with it? Is there some guidance or wisdom that you can give? Because that would be very valuable to those types of people if they ever get to a place where they're running a government. Or is it to make a deliberate effort to identify some person? Suppose you have a board meeting, you have a meeting with your friends, it can be a social meeting, you say, let's take half an hour and try and figure out, is there somebody in our acquaintance, maybe some next generation person who's got the potential to be a cut higher than what we've been electing to the parliament, to the legislatures and municipal councils, potential for competence, for commitment, for character. And should we get behind them? Should we try to encourage them to go that direction and assure them that we will support them along that way if they go that direction? Whatever it is, let's do something to ensure that the future of Canada is positive and bright, not just for ourselves, but for our children and for our grandchildren and for generations to come. Thank you.
And now we turn to you as the audience. We do have a number of written questions. As Peter mentioned earlier, you're welcome to submit them. Matt Lane is collecting a number of them, and we'll try to go through them in a number of the minutes provided. The first question, Preston, is there has been a surge in young people over the past several months and involvement in the political process. What do you think about this? And can we build on this success in getting more young people involved? What do you think?
Is this, how do
You know
you turn?
what, why don't you just...
Or come there? I'll trade you places. Okay. Well, I think that is, I have observed that myself, and I think that's an encouraging development. I think it's partly prompted by an increasing number of young people becoming disillusioned with politics and the things as they see them and deciding to get involved to try to change it. And I think that's a positive thing and should be encouraged. And one of the ways you can help, particularly younger people that are actually aspiring to perhaps get into public office themselves, is to help equip them with the skills and the knowledge that they need when they get there. I'm repeating myself, but the idea that you can learn on the job, you can't anymore. And you got to arrive prepared, and there's a lot we can do. Cicero wrote in his journal, remember old Cicero, the Roman senator, who was ambitious as a son of a gun when he was younger than them. And he wrote in his journal, for 10 years, he wrote in his journal, enter prepared, and trate parati in Latin, enter prepared. And the guy spent 10 years getting ready to do something about those ambitions that he felt as a young person.
Excellent. The next question, and by the way, Preston has written a book on the topic, Do Something. So be sure to read that. The next question is, what ought we to do in Canada with pipeline construction, considering that Quebec does not want pipelines, among others?
Well, the short answer is to replace the federal government with one that doesn't obstruct pipeline development. I don't think there's any alternative to that. You have to get governments that see the development of the energy industry as a positive. Yes, there's environmental concerns that have to be taken into account, but there's ways and means of doing that. But these governments that just whose whole approach to the natural resource sector is not just the energy sector, but to these other sectors, is to stop somebody from doing anything. I think they have to be replaced. I don't think you can convert them. In the case of the Quebec government itself, the current Quebec, the CAQ is likely to be re-elected on August the 3rd, and that government is opposed to particularly the NLG line that would go across Quebec to supply LNG to the European market. But the encouraging thing in Quebec is that embryonic Conservative Party of Quebec, CPQ, that Eric Duhem took over just a short while ago, when it was at 1% in the polls, at 20% in the polls now. So there is an upsurge in Quebec for an alternative approach. They won't replace the government, but they could conceivably put enough pressure on that government. It's got to rethink this obstruction to everything going towards, in terms of pipelines going to seaboard. But replace the government, that's my short answer.
The next question is, are you concerned about the future state of Canada's economy with high inflation, rising interest rates, outflow of business capital, and so forth?
Yes, and of course the short answer is all of us should be concerned about that, and I am as well. And so that then requires, what are the policies that can counteract those trends, particularly what can get government spending and borrowing and printing money under control. And again, I'm repeating myself, but I think until you can come to grips with the huge federal bureaucracy that actually favors those kinds of policies, you're not going to make that change. I'll tell you a funny story on this, and you know, us political guys who get older, we embellish these stories, so just it may not be the whole truth. But anyway, Chrétien has this story. Some of you will remember Pierre Elliott Trudeau spent money like a drunken sailor for most of his term, but towards the last, he had a session with the German chancellor who talked to him, who was a socialist, but who talked to him that eventually you got to balance the budget. So Trudeau came back to Canada, went on television. Chrétien was his finance minister. Chrétien says he didn't even learn about this until he watched the boss on television. And Trudeau went on television and said, we're going to balance the budget. So Cretchen's the finance minister. He says, I called in the deputy the next morning and I said, the boss says we got to balance the budget. You give me a list of 20 things we can cut. So the guy says, yes, minister, goes away, comes back with a list of 20 things. And Cretchen looks at it and says, this is a great list, but the item on the top, it is a park in Shawinigan, which was Cretchen's writing. And Cretchen swears this is what happened. And he says, the guy looked him in the eye and said, Minister, something is always in somebody's writing. In other words, we can make this as painful as we like. You want to pursue this policy? So that's this obstacle. Even if you can come up with a more rational monetary policy, fiscal policy, whatever, how to implement it, again, coming to grips with how to instruct the bureaucratic party.
All right. We have a deluge of great questions. So the next question is, the Manitoba Conservatives are looking at a next election. Any advice to them?
Yes, that's right, win the election. Well, I wouldn't presume to know enough about Manitoba politics, but one of the problems that you will face, and I think MLAs know this better than I do, it's a problem in Alberta, it's a problem all across, is this growing urban-rural divide. We've got this in Alberta too, where there's a larger and larger portion of the population is in the urban areas who have a different way of thinking about a lot of the issues than the people in the country. And I think the party that can come up with some way of bridging the urban-rural divide so that it just doesn't end up Conservatives getting support in the country and Socialists getting support in the cities, which is starting to be the inclination, that would be one thing to work on. I did convene a little meeting of 2 or 3 think tank people a month or so ago about how would you bridge that divide. And one of the interesting suggestions was the food policy. And this woman from the Canada West Foundation said, you've got more and more people in the urban areas are starting to ask, where did this food come from? They're starting to ask questions that can be answered by a country guy. More and more people in the country, particularly ranchers now, are starting to ask, well, what is it that this urban consumer wants in terms of my product? And her argument was this desire to know more about food on both directions might be a bridge between the urban and the rural. And her suggestion was that if you were running in a provincial or a federal election, your food policy might be something that would resonate both in the country and in the city, which might help this divide that you have in Manitoba as well.
Next question. Education, school boards in particular, have immense power to influence attitudes of tomorrow's next generation. Today we see a focus on identity politics and a shame and misrepresentation of Canada's history. How can we overcome this?
Well, there's sort of 2 questions there. There's how to overcome it, and again, what kind of educational reforms are needed to make the educational system more accountable to parents and students. But on the broader philosophical question, I think Canadians just have to be confronted with it. You got 2 options. One is that you can start and continue to attach rights and entitlements to people based on their race, their sexual identity, their language, their whatever, on these distinctive personal characteristics. You can go down that road where you attach rights and entitlements to people based on those criteria, which makes it necessary for me to know what your rights are, to ask you what's your race, what's your language, what's your sexual orientation, and so forth. Or you can go down the route where we are going to treat all Canadians equal in law regardless of And if I was participating in a campaign today where that question came up in a question period, that's exactly the question I would put. Say, you people here, if there's somebody on the stage that's advocating that other position, I say, you have to decide which is better, that route or this route. And I think if you present it that way, there's a good chance of persuading a majority of people that you're better to argue for equality in law regardless of these personal characteristics rather than entitlements because of them.
Excellent. Do you have any thoughts on the extent to which public discourse is censored in Canada. Bill C-11 comes to mind.
Well, this is a worry from a democratic standpoint. The more you censor and restrict public discussion. Now, I think one of the encouraging things is the growth of these independent media. We're outside the legacy media, and there's more and more of that happening. But for those independent sources of communication to grow, they need public support. They need you to subscribe to them and so forth. The other thing I think is just I'm talking more about the media's capacity to censor and cripple public discourse, to recognize the perspective of the legacy media, and I've sometimes challenged them on this. The conventional wisdom in the traditional media is that negative is more newsworthy than positive. Emotion is more newsworthy than rationality. Conflict is more newsworthy than peacemaking. So, if someone's got a message that is negative, conflict creating, and emotional, it will be amplified by that system. If someone has a message that is positive and peacemaking and rational, not only will it not be amplified by that system, it'll literally be censored out. And I think more and more people had to understand that's the perspective of the national news, or I understand that's what it is. That's why you're getting what you're getting through that. I think we have a better understanding of that, and particularly taught children that. The other thing, I shouldn't get onto this, but this business, in the COVID thing, there's been all this argument from the powers that be that their health protection measures were based on the science, that they're following the science narrative. Now, I understand that the average, you can get a journalism degree from Carleton or what's the other big school that gives journalism degrees, without a single course in physics, biology, chemistry, math, or statistics. I once asked a member of the National Press Gallery, can you explain to me how a flashlight battery operates? And of course the guy reaches for his phone and said, no, I don't want to know what Professor Google says. I want to know what you know. And the guy can't explain the flashlight. You're going to explain to me how a virus works, but you don't know how a flashlight actually works. In other words, and the media guys are not equipped for that, nor are the politicians. You can get a political science degree, and I know there's people in the room here, but you can get that without any of the science. So if you want to know what the science says, you've got to try to go to source. You cannot rely on what's said by a bureaucrat or by a politician or a media person on interpreting the science. And so I think that's another way of combating this, is go to source if you can, or go to somebody that might know the source.
I'd like to call Wayne Anderson to come forward now. And as Wayne comes forward, the final question is, what can we as citizens do? In a short answer, Preston, what would you say?
Well, I just repeat the last 5 things I told you. You can draw to the attention of your own political people the absolute importance of these resource sectors. You can undertake to try to find some people of competence and character and commitment to encourage them to participate in public life. And you can do all those last little list of things there to do, or come up with your own to-do list. There's a conference in Red Deer this weekend of some of the conservative think tanks and all of that, and I was asked to do a 1-minute clip on what would help advance the cause. And I said it would be if you ended your presentation, if you ended your speech, if you ended your lecture, if you ended your podcast or whatever, with a little to-do list. Don't stop with, we've had a great discussion. Come up with a to-do list. So I would encourage you, come up with your own to-do list.
Wow. First, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I've been involved with the Frontier Center for a long time, and this is very, very encouraging. So thank you again, all of you, for coming. I was particularly taken by the part of Preston's comments that referred to populism. And one of the reasons is that the other day I read a piece that he wrote called Beyond Left and Right. and it referred to Tocqueville and the aristocratic passion and the democratic passion as terms or phrases that might replace left and right, which is a paradigm that is meaningless today, or some of us would think that it's pretty much meaningless. And what that means is that the aristocratic passion are the aristocrats who don't trust the people, and their outlook is to limit the authority of the people. And the democratic passion, and I believe these are actually Preston's words, functions to extend the authority of the people. So this is about populism, and that's why that particular part of your address today really resonated, Preston. And as it says behind me, and something that the Frontier Center has talked about for ages, is that ideas are important. Ideas really matter. And I would say to you that Preston is a man of ideas. And Preston, we thank you for your ideas and your contribution to Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wayne Anderson, the chair of the board of directors of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. Thank you. Well said. That brings us to the close of our program. We're so delighted that you could come with us. One action is get involved in the Frontier Center for Public Policy. There's opportunities to volunteer, be involved. We want everything. Frontier does not receive, on principle, any government funding, so please donate. It's you, people, generous donors who make Frontier happen, so thank you. Pay attention to our newsletter. We're delighted by a number of things. We're proud to announce that on November 9th, our next luncheon will be with the Honorable Grant Devine, who will be talking about the watershed moments of public policy as Saskatchewan turned from socialism to great opportunity, so don't miss it. We're also delighted to highlight the programs on our podcast, Leaders on the Frontier. Please check our YouTube channel, Frontier, where you can learn more about all kinds of past discussions. Today, we are very delighted to announce that our discussion on the importance of civil society and shared cultural values with Leon Fontaine is being released today at 3:30 p.m. We also are delighted to announce that on September the 30th, Leaders on the Frontier will be welcoming the three authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford University, and Dr. Martin Koldorf, renowned epidemiologist from Harvard University. Those physicians will be discussing the Great Barrington Declaration as well as lessons learned after the last 2.5 years. That brings an end to our luncheon, so thank you very much for coming. Until next time we meet, thank you and have a great day.